Hi, we're students from Pomona High School, and today we'll be talking about Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson.
Okay. So I think something that we all noticed was that there were certain words throughout the middle of the sentences that were capitalized. Lillian, do you want to talk to us about that?
I thought that Dickinson did it just to emphasize sort of the main points of her poem by capitalizing those words because they're like the big meaningful words in the poem, like death and ourselves and immortality.
Mm-hmm. Dakota, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think it's sort of like she starts talking about how death stopped for her, and then sort of how he sort of picks her up and takes her away, and then later on we sort of see it's sort of a journey. So she's sort of passing everything she's sort of lived through. So her school, sort of sees children at recess sort of playing, and then they're just sort of passing all that. So it's almost like she's passing by what her life was.
All right. Kyle. So the last line of the first stanza says, "and immortality." Do you want to talk to us about immortality?
Well, I thought this was strange because she's getting in a carriage with death, and she emphasizes immortality instead of mortality. And I think that was pretty strange, but I think that she's trying to emphasize that death isn't the end, because she's talking about immortality, and I think it has something to do with going further on after you die.
Yeah, I agree. Emily, in the next stanza, what does haste mean?
I think it means rush, because when it says we slowly drove, he knew no rush. I think that's talking about how death, because I think death is he's so, he wants to get there quickly. He doesn't want to get there quickly. He wants to get there slower, and
Yeah, and I think another point to add in is because he doesn't want to rush, he's kind of allowing this relaxed kind of feeling for when she's in the carriage with him.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like death is kind of this relaxing process, and it's not quick or anything. It's kind of slow and relaxing. And
So do you think the person's already dead, and this is just the journey?
yes, because if we look down at the last stanza, it says, "Since then to centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day." And feels shorter than the day means that it happened yesterday. It feels like it happened yesterday. And this at the last stanza, she's saying that this happened centuries ago, and her death feels like it was yesterday.
Yeah.
I think she's sort of talking about when she says, "Feel shorter than the day," and it keeps going. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. Sort of like there is no end. Like this is gonna go on forever. Like I'm dead and I'm here, but it's never gonna end. And so she's sort of it's been centuries since I die, and yet those centuries feel shorter than the day I figured out it was never gonna end. That I was gonna be here for eternity.
I feel like that sort of plays into her immortality part because even though she's not mortal or not alive anymore, she's still continuing on through the whole
Right.
thing even though she's dead.
Yeah. Emily, in the third stanza at the last line it says, "We passed the setting sun." What do you think that means?
I think the phrase when you think about the sun setting, that kind of represents the end of the day. And I feel like it's interesting how they said we passed the setting sun because it shows how maybe time might be running out, but you're passing it, so maybe it's not over yet. And it goes back to the word immortality and that this isn't the end.
Another point I want to make is that after she states that we passed the setting sun, in the next stanza it says, or rather, he passed us, almost like setting sun means your life. Like you're slowly driving and you're reaching the end of your life, but in this case, the setting sun is personified, and it's like the setting sun kind of ends your life for you. It passes you before you even know it.
I think also like it says like we passed the school, we passed the fields, and then we passed the setting sun, or rather he passed us. Like the entire time they weren't moving, but the world's moving away from them because they're like actually like dead now. They're in a different sort of reality, and where they're not part of it anymore, and the world's moving past them.
Yeah, it's almost like this carriage ride. It seems like an ordinary day until the very end. It's like we're going to school, we pass the school, we pass the fields of grazing grain. It seems like it's an ordinary day.
Llama, do you have something?
Just when you guys were talking about the we passed the setting sun, and then you said, or rather he passed us. Earlier, Emily said that he may be death. So do you think maybe time was stopped for them and death was passing through them? Or how do you think that applies to that stanza?
We thought the he in that stanza with the he passed us meant the sun instead of death, because it says in the earlier stanza, we passed the setting sun, and then, or rather, he passed us.
Yeah, almost like it's the end of your life.
At least.
Okay. Kyle, on the fourth stanza, in the last two lines, some of the vocabulary and the word choices were interesting. You want to talk to us about that?
Sure. Okay, so gossamer means like this delicate, flimsy material, and the author describes this with gown and tippet and tulle. It's almost like she's wearing a wedding dress. That's how I imagine it in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And before that, it kind of sets up the story for like the end of her life.
Mm-hmm.
But weddings usually mean the beginning of something new,
Right.
the beginning of a new life. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah. So do you think that that is signifying like the start of an afterlife, or?
Yeah, definitely. I think this signifies that her life is not over even though she's dead. And in the next stanza after that, it says, we paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. Swelling of the ground, we can kind of infer, means like a grave kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
the swelling of the ground. But he compares this with a house. And houses are usually not compared with graves. It kind of gives like a homey feel, a comforting feel.
Lillian, do you have anything to add to that?
I thought for the gossamer part, because oftentimes gossamer means like spider webs, so it kind of went back to the whole death thing, and then being in the grave or a coffin, that sort of she's dressed in spider webs because she's dead.
Yeah.
Okay, so throughout the poem, Dickinson kind of builds this relationship between the narrator and death. Do you guys think that possibly those two are married together, or is there any sort of significance in that relationship?
Well, I think it seems almost like romanticized, like the way she sort of talks about it. It's like a very personal thing that she almost like seems to understand, especially in some of her other works too, like Emily Dickinson sort of writes dark stuff. So I think like she romanticizes it, but I mean the idea that there's a relationship, I don't know, everybody dies. So
I don't know, it kind of seems like there's a relationship because they're going in this carriage together, they drove away, death is kind of being relaxed and stuff. There's definitely something.
Yeah, it seems like they do kind of almost have a respect for each other. The word civility in the second stanza, I found out means reasonable or respectful behavior, and it seems like they act very kind towards each other, and it says it in the first stanza too, he kindly stopped for me, so it seems like they do have some sort of relationship.
So what would be the theme of this whole poem?
would think it's the acceptance of death, or rather knowing that death continues on and there's a life after death.
Mhm. What about you, Dakota?
Well, I don't know if I have a theme. I was more sort of looking at like, because I could not stop for death, I thought that was interesting. If they sort of have a relationship, like why can't she stop if she's sort of like so romantic about the idea of it?
Mhm.